Mr. President, I turn now to an important issue of substance, namely whether, as a matter of international law, an occupation can be unlawful. The United States, as you heard earlier, contends that an occupation cannot be unlawful or lawful. It argues that occupation is governed exclusively by international humanitarian law, which is concerned only with the acts of the occupying power and has nothing to say about the legality of the occupation itself. For the United States, when it comes to occupation, international humanitarian law is both the start and the end. It is the only game in town. Guyana, like dozens of other states and international organisations, disagrees. Put simply, there is a distinction between the law of occupation on the one hand and the legality of an occupation on the other. The conduct of an occupation is governed by international humanitarian law, while the legality of an occupation as a whole is determined by the United Nations Charter and general international law. The argument advanced by the United States that occupation is governed solely by international humanitarian law leaves no room for the application of the Charter or general international law. In particular, it leaves no room for the principle enshrined in Article 2.4 of the Charter that acquisition of territory by force is absolutely prohibited. An argument which leaves no room for the application of that fundamental principle of international law, a peremptory norm, is not a sound one. How then does one determine whether Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is unlawful? The answer, Guyana submits, is straightforward. It is to be found in the principle that occupation is inherently and exclusively a temporary state of affairs, and in the Jus Cogens prohibition on acquisition of territory by force. The inherently temporary character of occupation is reflected in the principle that an occupying power does not acquire sovereignty, not one atom, as Oppenheimer memorably put it, over the occupied territory. It is also reflected in the duty of the occupying power to preserve the status quo ante and to refrain from making any permanent changes to the occupied territory. Temporariness, in short, is the very core and essence of occupation. And it is notable that none of the 57 states and international organisations which filed written statements in these proceedings contend otherwise. It follows that permanent occupation is not occupation at all. It is military conquest. It is annexation. And annexation is, of course, strictly forbidden under international law. It therefore necessarily follows that an occupation which is intended to be permanent is unlawful under international law. Applying these principles, Guyana submits that it is indisputable that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is unlawful as a whole. The unlawfulness arises from the fact that Israel has annexed most of the occupied territory, de jure and de facto, including by implanting almost 750,000 Israeli settlers in hundreds of settlements, which Israel's leaders have promised never to remove. In Jerusalem, Israel has formally declared sovereignty over the occupied territory and has expressly extended the application of its domestic laws to that territory. This is a classic, quintessential example of de jure annexation, and it is irrefutable evidence that Israel intends its occupation to be permanent. Over many years, Israel's leaders have repeatedly proclaimed East Jerusalem to be an inseparable part of Israel. In the words of Israel's current Prime Minister, East Jerusalem has been and always will be ours, and will remain only under Israel's sovereignty. This unequivocal declaration, and many others like it, have been accompanied by far-reaching actions. These include the systematic implantation of more than 230,000 Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem, an exercise in deliberate demographic manipulation that has profoundly changed the composition, the character, and the status of the Holy City. In the rest of the West Bank, Israel has conducted a similar decades-long process of implanting 500,000 Israeli settlers in more than 270 illegal settlements. Those settlements and the network of settler-only roads and infrastructure which connect them form a vast, interconnected constellation of illegal colonies to which Israel has extended the application of its domestic laws. The intent and the effect is to establish permanent Israeli dominion throughout the West Bank. Indeed, the highest officials in successive Israeli governments have openly and brazenly declared an intention to exercise sovereignty over the entire West Bank, which they have renamed Judea and Samaria, and which they define as an integral and inseparable part of the land of Israel. Israel has created, expanded, and entrenched its sprawling network of settlements in the face of repeated condemnation of the illegality of those actions by the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Secretary-General, a plethora of UN committees and rapporteurs, as well as the international community and, of course, this very court.